When I inherited my grandma's estate, I did something my family still doesn't know about. I moved the entire thing, almost $800,000 worth of house and savings, into a trust with my name locked in as trustee and beneficiary. My name is Victoria, I'm 32, and I've spent most of my life being the quiet one in the room, the one people think won't fight back, the one they can push aside. So when my grandma died and left me her beach house and the rest of her estate, I could already feel the storm brewing behind the fake condolences and tight smiles. I didn't cry much at the funeral. I was too busy hearing her voice in my head saying, "Don't be naive, sweetheart. Money changes people, especially the ones who share your last name." So I listened. I sat with a lawyer, signed what needed to be signed, and built a wall of legal concrete around that house. I didn't brag. I didn't post anything. I didn't even hint that I knew what I was doing. I just waited. Last week, the knock came. I opened the door and saw them standing there, side by side, dressed like they were going to brunch instead of to ambush me. My brother had that smug grin he wears when he thinks he's already won, and my mom wouldn't even meet my eyes at first. They walked in like they owned the place, like I was a guest in my own living room. He dropped a stack of papers on the coffee table and said, almost laughing, that they had gone ahead and taken care of the paperwork, that the house was now legally in his name, that I had until Friday to pack up my life and get out. I looked at the papers, looked at his face, then at hers, and for a second my chest tightened with the same old hurt I've carried since I was a kid. Then something in me clicked. I smiled, leaned back, and asked, "You really think I'd let that happen?" Before I tell you what I saw in his eyes when I said that, and what actually happened after I walked away from that living room, tell me this. What time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm honestly curious how far this story of family, money, and revenge is about to travel. The moment those words left my mouth, the room shifted, like the air changed temperature. But my brother didn't back down. Not yet, because he still thought I was the girl who used to cover for him when he crashed my grandma's car and lied about it, or when he stole from her wallet and swore it wasn't him. He pulled the papers closer to me and said, "Come on, Vic, stop being dramatic. This is just practical. You can't handle all this. Mom and I talked to a lawyer, it's already done." I didn't say his name out loud yet. I just watched his fingers tap the signature line where some shaky version of my name was scribbled, and I wondered how many nights he had spent convincing himself that forging my signature was just taking what's fair. The way he used to tell himself taking my tips from the diner was borrowing. My mom finally spoke, her voice soft but with that sharpness I know too well, telling me this was for my own good, that I was too emotional about the house, that it was just a property, and that my grandma would have wanted the family to share. It was almost funny hearing her talk about what grandma would have wanted when she hardly visited her in the last year, too busy chasing some new man and his bank account. I picked up the stack of papers and flipped through them slowly, pretending to read, but I didn't need to. I had already seen this coming in my nightmares, and in the quiet, what-if scenarios I played in my head the week after the funeral. In one of those late-night mental movies, I saw my brother standing exactly where he was now, waving documents and threatening to kick me out. In another, I saw myself crying and begging, because that's who I used to be with them. But the version of me in this reality had already met with my own lawyer, had already recorded every conversation with the estate attorney, had already locked every asset into a trust they couldn't touch without committing obvious, traceable fraud. So instead of breaking down, I raised an eyebrow and asked, "Which lawyer did you use?" And I saw the quick flash of panic in my mom's eyes before she covered it with a tight smile and dropped some vague name of a friend who helped with the paperwork. My brother jumped in, explaining how he had talked to the bank and fixed the deed, and I could almost hear the lies stacking on top of each other like a house of cards next to the real house, the one that was legally wrapped in steel around me. For a second, I imagined what was going on in his head. Him replaying the moment he slid a couple of bills across a desk to some sketchy notary, convinced that as long as he had a paper with a stamp, he was untouchable. He thought this was just like when we were kids, and he could manipulate Mom into taking his side, no matter what he did to me. But this time, there were rules, laws, and a dead woman's final wishes carved into documents he had never seen. I set the forged deed down and said calmly, "You know what's interesting? The attorney who handled Grandma's estate called me last week and asked if I'd been approached by anyone trying to help me simplify things. I wonder why he'd ask that." My brother's grin faltered. My mom's hand tightened around her purse strap, and for the first time, they both really looked at me, not as the quiet kid in the corner, but as a problem they hadn't calculated right. If you were standing in my shoes right then, with your own family caught between greed and fear in your living room, would you have blown everything up on the spot? Or would you have played along and given them just enough rope to hang themselves? I didn't explode that day because the truth is, my revenge didn't start when they showed up with those fake papers. It started months earlier. The night I woke up from a dream where I watched bulldozers tear down my grandma's beach house while my brother and my mom stood in the distance taking selfies in front of a new condo, and I woke up with my heart racing and my grandma's voice in my head again, telling me to stop hoping these people would change. Back then, before the funeral, I was still clinging to this fantasy that grief might make my family softer, that maybe losing the one person who actually loved us unconditionally would pull us together. But grief didn't soften them. It sharpened their edges. I still remember sitting in the lawyer's office the first time, my hands shaking as I signed documents making me the sole heir, his pen gliding over the trust papers as he explained how this structure would protect the house and the money from any outside interference. And when I asked if outside interference included my own family, he held my gaze for a long second and said, "It includes anyone who is not you." After that meeting, I started writing everything down: dates, times, every weird comment my mom made about how big the place is for just one person, or how my brother joked about finally being able to host real parties once the house is ours, like my future homelessness was the setup for some punchline. I told them as little as possible, downplaying the value of the estate, pretending I was overwhelmed and confused while I was actually meeting the lawyer again and again, setting up safeguards, asking what would happen if someone tried to forge my signature. What would happen if someone tried to pressure me into signing under duress? How long it would take to challenge fraudulent deeds. He showed me case files, talked about criminal charges, and I listened, filing away every worst-case scenario as fuel. I walked through the house at night, thinking about my grandma teaching me how to cook in that tiny kitchen, about the summer nights on the porch when she told me stories about how she had started with nothing and had to fight for every inch she owned, and I argued with myself in those rooms, torn between wanting to believe my mom might choose me over money and knowing deep down that she never had before. It wasn't just about the house. It was about every time my brother broke something of mine and my mom told me to stop being dramatic. Every time I brought home straight A's and she barely looked up while she bragged about him getting a job he'd quit 2 months later. The trust wasn't just legal strategy. It was the first time I chose myself over them. So when they finally came with their scam, I had already rehearsed the possibilities in my head. They'd try charm, then guilt, then anger, then threats. Part of me still wanted to give them one last chance, to see if, when cornered, they would choose to back off and save what was left of our relationship. But another part of me knew that if I blinked, if I let them win this, I'd be confirming the story they'd always told themselves about me, that I was easy to steamroll. I decided that day to collect evidence instead of arguments. I told them I would think about it, that I was overwhelmed, that I needed time, and when my brother smirked at my supposed weakness, I let him. I watched my mom's relief when she thought I might cave. As soon as they left, I took pictures of every page they had dropped on my table, every forged signature, every fake notarization, every date that didn't line up with when I had actually been at the lawyer's office locking those assets away. I emailed everything to my attorney with one line: "You were right. It's happening." Have you ever sat alone in your home and realized that the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you now have to protect yourself from? The days between that visit and the showdown felt like a countdown to some kind of quiet war, and I decided if they wanted to play games with paperwork, I'd invite them to a stage where there would be witnesses, records, and no way to spin the story later. So I texted my mom and brother and said we needed a family meeting at the house before any decisions were made, deliberately using the same guilt-laced language they always used on me. And they agreed so fast it was almost insulting. They thought I was calling them to surrender. My lawyer and I mapped out the timeline like a battle plan. First the meeting, then if they pushed, a lawsuit for fraud and elder financial abuse, because while my grandma was mentally sharp, she was physically frail near the end, and some of those conversations they'd had with her about what's fair hadn't been as innocent as they liked to pretend. In between strategy sessions, I went digging and found more than I expected. My brother, whose name is Jake, had been gambling, not just a little, but enough to leave a trail of maxed-out credit cards and shady loan messages on his phone that he forgot to hide when he borrowed my laptop months ago and forgot to log out of his accounts. My mom, Sarah, had co-signed on some of his debts, which meant if he didn't find a miracle soon, both of them would be in serious trouble. No wonder they wanted the house. It wasn't about family or fairness. It was about plugging the holes in a sinking ship with the walls of the only place that had ever been safe for me. A few nights before the meeting, Jake sent me a text that was supposed to sound like a joke but read like a threat. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Vic. You know you can't fight us." I stared at that message for a long time, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, wanting to write something sharp and final. But instead I just replied, "We'll talk at the house," because I wanted him to put everything on record when it counted. In the quiet moments, fear still crawled up my spine. I'd stand in the hallway, looking at the family pictures my grandma kept on the wall, wondering if she would be proud of what I was about to do or heartbroken that it had come to this. I practiced what I would say in the mirror, not the messy emotional rants I used to have as a teenager when my mom chose Jake's side, but clean, controlled sentences that a judge, a jury, or a camera could understand. I imagined the worst-case version of the meeting, them screaming, threatening to cut me off forever, calling me ungrateful, maybe even lunging at me, and I prepared for that. I also imagined a version where they realized they were cornered and backed down, but that one felt less real every time I replayed the texts they sent. My lawyer gave me one last piece of advice: record everything. So I set up my phone in a way that looked natural, casually plugged in on a side table, camera pointed just right. I printed copies of the trust documents, the original will, and even the email trail between my grandma, me, and the attorney, and I kept them in a folder on the kitchen counter where I could reach them fast. I wasn't just planning to survive that meeting. I was planning to turn it into Exhibit A. When the day of the meeting came, Jake and Sarah walked into the beach house like they were stepping onto a stage where they had already written the script. Jake in his best shirt, Sarah with that brittle smile she uses when she wants to look like the reasonable adult in the room, and they sat down at the table without even asking if I wanted to sit first. Like always. Like hierarchy was still on their side. Jake opened with fake concern. telling me he'd been thinking a lot and that no one wants to see me stressed, then pivoted into how it just makes more sense for him to manage the property because he was better with business and I was more of the emotional type. And Sarah nodded, adding that I could always stay with her until I got back on my feet, as if the idea of me being homeless was just a temporary inconvenience. I let them talk. I nodded in the right places, asked small questions that kept them going, and every word, every smirk, every manipulative phrase slipped neatly into the audio recording humming quietly from my phone, the little invisible witness on the side table. When Jake pulled out the same stack of forged papers and pushed them toward me again, saying we could handle this privately without dragging outsiders into family matters, I took a deep breath and decided that was the moment to flip the script. I stood up, walked to the counter, and came back with my folder, laying it down next to his. I told them I had something I wanted to share too. Jake rolled his eyes, but Sarah looked uneasy, like she could feel the ground shifting even before she knew why. I opened the folder and spread out the certified copy of my grandma's will, the trust documents, and a letter from the attorney addressed to me, dated weeks before they even thought about their little scheme. In a calm voice that didn't sound like me from a few years ago, I explained that the house and all related assets had been placed into an irrevocable trust, that I was the sole trustee and beneficiary, and that any attempt to transfer ownership without my consent or outside the structure of that trust was not only invalid, but could be considered fraud. Jake laughed, a short, mean sound, and said, "You're bluffing." But his eyes were darting over the legal stamps on the papers, and I could see the moment he realized this wasn't just something I printed off the internet. Then I pulled out the pictures I had taken of his forged deed, the fake notary stamp, the date that conflicted with when I had been physically present at the attorney's office across town, and laid them out like cards at a poker table. I told them the lawyer already had copies, that he had advised me to document everything, and that if they continued to push, we would not be keeping this in the family. Say, Sarah's face went pale, and she turned on Jake instantly, snapping his name, asking what he had done, how he could be so stupid. For a second, the two of them forgot I was even in the room, arguing with each other as if their betrayal of me was just a bad business decision. I watched them, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and grief. This was the price of finally standing up for myself. When they turned back to me, Jake tried one last tactic, his voice shaking now as he begged, said he was in trouble, that he just needed a little help, that we could fix the paperwork and nobody had to know. And Sarah chimed in with guilt, saying I was tearing the family apart, that I was choosing a house over my own blood. I told them I wasn't choosing a house over them. I was choosing boundaries over being used. I told them I would not be signing anything, that I had already started the process of protecting myself legally, and that if they tried to move forward with their fraudulent deed, I would file charges. That was when Jake snapped and said something he should never have said out loud, that he had already used the forged document as collateral in a conversation with someone who wasn't exactly patient about getting paid back. My skin went cold. Not from fear for me, but from realizing just how far he'd been willing to drag my grandma's legacy into his mess. I didn't yell. I just added that confession to the growing list of reasons we were going to court. By the time we ended up in an actual courtroom, with fluorescent lights humming overhead and the smell of stale coffee in the air, the story had shifted from some messy private family drama to a case with a case number, a judge, and a record that wouldn't disappear just because my mom didn't want to talk about it anymore. And sitting at that long wooden table, I felt both exposed and strangely powerful. My lawyer handled most of the speaking, but I had prepared myself for my part, and every time I answered a question, I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, loud but steady. Jake and Sarah sat on the other side, their lawyer leaning in to whisper things that clearly weren't giving them the comfort they wanted, because Jake couldn't stop bouncing his leg, and Sarah's hands were clenched so tight around her purse that her knuckles were white. The judge went through the documents first. The original will, the trust papers, the timeline of when everything had been signed, and then the forged deed, the fake notary stamp, the dates that didn't match. It felt almost surreal seeing my family's lies laid out so clinically, stripped of the emotional manipulation that had always made them so effective. When it was my turn to speak, I told the story as simply as I could, starting with my grandma's decision to leave the estate to me, describing how she had talked to me about responsibility, about wanting at least one person in the family to have some stability, and then explaining how, after the funeral, the comments about sharing and fairness started creeping in. I didn't say Jake's name with anger. I said it like I was reading from a script, and somehow that made the impact stronger. My attorney played a portion of the audio from the family meeting, the part where Jake pushed the forged papers and talked about keeping things private, and the courtroom was silent except for his own voice coming through the speakers, confident at first, then shaky as I laid out the real documents. In my head, I was back in the living room hearing it all over again, but this time, instead of feeling small, I watched the judge's face tighten at key phrases, saw the clerk keep looking up from her notes. Jake's lawyer tried to spin it, painting him as desperate as someone who made a bad choice under financial pressure, and my mom leaned into that narrative hard, crying, saying she didn't understand the details, that she thought it was all above board, that she only wanted what was fair for both her children. But my lawyer calmly pointed out the texts, the timelines, the inconsistencies between what she was saying now and what she had said in that recorded meeting. At one point, the judge asked me directly how it felt to be in the position of asking the court to rule against my own family, and for a moment, I hesitated. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I knew whatever I said would live in the transcript forever. I told the truth. That it felt like ripping out a piece of myself, but that letting them get away with this would have been like erasing everything my grandma had fought for, and everything I had learned about my own worth. I said I wasn't in that courtroom to punish them for being flawed or selfish. I was there to draw a line that should have been drawn years ago. Justice didn't feel clean or satisfying in that moment. It felt heavy and complicated, but it also felt necessary. When the judge finally ruled, the words came out measured and unemotional, but to me, they landed like a door closing on one version of my life and opening another. The court upheld the validity of my grandma's will and the trust, declared the forged deed invalid, and referred the matter of the fraudulent documents to the appropriate authorities for possible criminal investigation, and in that instant, the house, the money, and everything my grandma had left me felt less like a prize and more like a shield I had fought hard to keep. Jake's face went red, then gray, his jaw clenched so tight I thought he might crack a tooth, and Sarah looked like someone had pulled the ground out from under her, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. Not because she didn't understand what was happening, but because for once, her version of reality wasn't the one everyone around her accepted. Their lawyers started talking about appeals, about options, about next steps. But honestly, I didn't care. The main battle was won. I walked out of that courthouse with my attorney, the folder of documents under my arm, and this strange mix of triumph and grief swirling in my chest. I had protected my grandma's legacy and my own future, but I knew something else had been lost for good. Whatever illusion I had left, that my family would someday choose me over their own interests. The legal consequences didn't stop at the verdict. Jake's little side deals and debts started catching up with him once it became clear he couldn't deliver on the house he'd bragged about. and some of the people he owed weren't the kind you want to disappoint. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that he'd lost his job after his boss found out about the investigation, and that the stress had sent him into an even deeper spiral. Sarah, who had once floated from relationship to relationship and lived off the charm she could turn on and off like a light switch, suddenly found herself alone more often because it turns out not everyone wants to be associated with someone whose name shows up in court records connected to fraud. A year later, I went to the beach house alone on a cold, windy evening, the kind of night my grandma used to wrap us in blankets and tell stories. And on my way back from picking up groceries, I saw Jake standing outside a rundown bar in town, shoulders hunched, talking to someone I didn't recognize. For a split second, his eyes met mine, and there was this flicker of recognition, of something like shame or maybe resentment, and I wondered if he blamed me for where he'd ended up or if, deep down, he knew he'd done this to himself. I didn't stop. I didn't wave. I drove back to the house, unloaded my bags, and sat on the porch, listening to the waves and thinking about the cost of the victory I'd fought for. Inside, the walls still held my grandma's pictures, her recipes, her stories, and now they held something else too. The proof that I could stand up for myself even when the people I was standing up to shared my blood. Sometimes I still ask myself if it was worth it, if keeping the house and the money justified losing whatever fragile, broken version of family I had left. And there are days when that question aches more than others. But then I remember how it felt to be that girl who was always expected to sacrifice, to give up space, to stay quiet. And I know I couldn't go back to that. Not even for a version of peace built on me being small. So now I honor my grandma by taking care of what she left me and by refusing to let her legacy be the bandage for someone else's bad decisions. And I'll leave you with this question, because I still wrestle with it myself. If you had to choose between protecting your future and keeping a family that only shows up when there's something to take, which loss would you be able to live with?